Chapter 8. Smack! A large rock hit the water with a resounding crash only inches from the sleuth. A deluge of spray drenched the boys. Chet at the helm could hardly see. Wiping the water from his eyes, he gunned the motor and took off. The sleuth made stern way from shore. "Gadzooks!" cried Jerry, mopping his face and looking towards the captors. "They've gone." "They can sure disappear in a hurry," said Jerry. "I wish we could have captured them. Frank, how's your leg?" "Oh, it's all right, but goodness, it hurts." He gave a wan smile. "Never mind that, though. The main thing is we found Joe." "Yeah, thank goodness," his brother said weakly. Chet had taken the sleuth into deep water and was now speeding towards Bayport. Jerry and Biff were busy trying to make Frank and Joe comfortable on one of the long seats. "To think I missed finding Joe," Chet said disgustedly. "I climbed those cliffs every other time and searched, and when Joe was found, where was I? Sitting in a boat." "Well, it's a good thing you were," Jerry retorted. "It's lucky for us someone was here to have that sleuth ready for a fast getaway." But why'd it have to be me?" Chet complained. "Oh, some fellas have all the luck. Joe, tell me about your captor. Who are those men who shot at you, and who was heaving those rocks? When did they take you into the cave?" "We best let Joe rest a while," Frank advised. "I think we ought to go back and clean up that gang," Jerry put in. "I'd like to learn more about them myself," Frank said, "but I think we best leave this to the police. Those kidnappers are a tough outfit, and we have Joe to look after, and he's in bad shape. We have to get him home." "He looks kind of hungry," Chet observed sympathetically as Frank turned in their radio and called police headquarters to report the rescue. Joe opened his eyes. "You bet I'm hungry." Chet grabbed the package of sandwiches he had brought with him and handed them to his chum. "I knew these would come in handy. Dig in." "Hold it," Frank warned. "No solid foods until the doctor says it's all right." "Well, then how about the milk from the thermos?" "Okay." Joe drank the milk slowly and gratefully while Joe satisfied Chet's curiosity about their experience in the cave rescue. Chet whistled. "That was sure a close squeak." When the Hardys reached home, their mother was overwhelmed with relief at seeing Joe safe. Aunt Gertrude hugged her nephew and said, "Well, this time you deserve some sympathy. At least you didn't do something harum-scarum and propel yourself right into a mess of trouble." Dr. Bates, the family physician, was summoned to examine the young detective. "Well, there's no eternal damage," he declared. "Just exhaustion. Joe, he'll be fit in a day or two. Frank, he has a deep bruise, which will be sore for quite a while." Joe was given a steaming bowl of hot soup and then put to bed, and he immediately fell asleep. Frank related the story of the rescue and gave Aunt Gertrude credit for the clue. She smiled and blushed, but said nothing. It was not until late that evening, after he had been refreshed by a long, sound sleep, that Joe was able to tell the others what had happened to him. He still looked pale, but good food and rest were beginning to do their work, and a trace of color had returned to his cheeks. "As you know," he said, "at Chet's party I was chased into the woods after that man who was looking into our car trunk, and as I got near, someone reached out and grabbed me. I couldn't see his face." Joe said a gag had been jammed into his mouth and a hand clasped over his mouth, and then he was dragged to a car. "Mercy!" exclaimed Aunt Gertrude. "But why'd he kidnap you if he was only after the secret radio?" Frank asked. "Well, there's another reason," Joe replied. "I'll come to that. When we got to his car, I tried to fight him, but he's as strong as an ox and managed to tie me up and throw me in the back seat. Then he drove away and we went down the road for some distance and stopped. 2 men came out of the bushes and walked over to us, and one of them said, 'Is that you, Gross?' And my captor growled at them, 'No names.' And when they saw me in the car, the men wanted to know who I was. It seemed they didn't know Gross was going to kidnap me." Joe said there had been a row about it, and the other two men had wanted Gross to bring him back, but he was stubborn. "This kid knows too much," Gross said. "He saw the rocks, and besides, his father's a detective." The other men, they called him a fool and said he should have left me alone and let the other thing go. One of them told Gross he didn't want the authorities after them for kidnapping, then they realized it was too late to let me go because there'd be trouble when I got back to Bayport and told my story. Joe said that the two men then got into the car and they all rode along for about 2 miles, and then one of the men climbed out and headed across a field towards the bay. We went on, but we hadn't gone far when Gross lost control of the wheel, and then we crashed into a ditch. The car was wrecked, but no one seemed to be hurt. Gross and the other fellows seemed worried because they were afraid someone would come along and find them, so they took off the license plate. Gross knew that there was an old inn nearby, so they agreed to go to it and telephone a friend of theirs to bring the sedan. They took a blanket out of the car and we walked up the road and into a lane where the inn was, and then without any warning one of them slugged me from behind. "And then put you in a blanket?" Frank asked. Joe then said later, as he started to come to the inn, a drug was forced into his mouth and he had been made to drink some water. He passed out and didn't wake up until morning, when they carried him in a blanket to their friend's sedan. "And just as we drove out the lane and onto the Grissom Road," Joe continued, "I heard a car coming and tried to rise up. It looked like ours, so I tried to signal. And then Gross, he shoved me back down." Joe had been driven to Shore Road and taken to a cave through an abandoned shaft. "You were there nearly 2 whole days," Frank replied. "Well, most of the time I was alone. They fixed me up a few sacks to lay on, but they didn't pay much attention to me. Once in a while they would bring in some sandwiches and water and feed them to me." "Did you find out what they're up to?" Frank asked. "At night when they thought I was asleep, I overheard enough to learn some of the gang's secrets. They're smugglers." Aunt Gertrude opened her mouth wide. "Smugglers? What kind?" "Diamonds and electronic equipment. That's probably why they wanted to get Mr. Wright's special radio." Joe paused and Miss Hardy asked if he were too tired to go on. "No, it's okay, Mother. I also learned that one of the top men, his name is Chris, and from what was said, I'd guess he's a big, fair-haired man who had been watching us." Frank was excited by this news. Now they had something definite to go on. If Joe was right, they would concentrate on finding Chris and turning him over to the police. Joe then spoke up. "There's 4 or 5 in the gang working with Chris, and others they're offshore. Chris, he delivers the smuggled diamonds, and his pals in the cave, one tall, dark, and one red-headed, and one short, mentioned that he had diamonds in his briefcase. Chris thought we had seen them when the case busted open. Gross took a chance to kidnap one of us to keep us from talking." "Well, that was a stupid move," Frank commented. "Even if we had seen the diamonds, we wouldn't have known they had been smuggled. What about Mr. Wright's secret radio? Did they talk about that?" "I'm not sure," Joe answered. "Gross mentioned a secret gadget, but since they smuggled electronic equipment, it could be anything. Do we still have the transistor?" he asked. "Yeah, but it's my guess someone connected with the smugglers found out we have the radio and thought it might be in our trunk. Do you know the names of any of the others in the gang?" Joe shook his head. "I'm sure there's a big boss, but they never mentioned him. One man who came to the cave had a nasally voice. He sounded like one of those burglars that was at Mr. Wright's house. And he's afraid of someone named Shorty," Frank added. "Well, this is a real clue." After a moment, he said thoughtfully, "So, we're up against a gang of smugglers." "I think," Aunt Gertrude said firmly, "that you boys should leave well enough alone. Joe is back safe and sound, and we ought to be satisfied. If you keep trying to track down those smugglers, you'll only end up in trouble.
You leave this to the police.
The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. Frank answered the call.
Are you one of the Hardy boys?
A strange voice asked. Yes, who is this?
The inventor of the secret radio.
What's your name? Frank asked.
You know I don't want to mention it on the phone. All I want to find out is whether you still have it,
the man replied. Frank was suspicious at once. He beckoned his mother and wrote on the telephone pad. He wrote, "Go next door and try to have this call traced, and then call the police and give them Joe's clues to the kidnappers." Aloud, Frank was saying, "Why are you so interested, sir?"
"Because I'm the inventor and I want the radio back,"
the stranger spoke sharply. A long parley followed, and finally, when Frank was sure his mother had had enough time to call the police, he said, "Sorry to not help you, sir, but you'll have to get your information from my father, and he's not here this minute."
"Your father?" the man shrieked. "Why, you impotent young pup, I'll be right over and you'll give me that radio or I'll...
The caller hung up. End of chapter 8.